Hey everyone, it's David Frederick, and thank you so much for stopping by my Composer's Corner. I say this all the time, but truly there's just a ton of content out there competing for your interest. So if you're here, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to hear what I have to say and what my guests have to say. If you really like what we're doing here, please subscribe and also like this video. We really would appreciate that. But without further ado, I'm so excited to tell you about my next guest. He's a friend of mine. I've known him since the mid 80s. He's an amazing dude, and he's got just a crazy background. And I think you're going to find this really interesting. In fact, I had to write down a ton of stuff here because his background is so extensive. So today's guest is my friend and musical brother, Duane Decker. Duane has been a professional musician for years. He's played all over the US, he's played all over Europe and Canada as a synthesist and as a keyboard player. He's served as a product specialist for Kurzweil, Emu. He's been all over the place on this. He's composed over 900 pieces of music. He's composed music and sound design for PC, video, console, and social media with over 70 internationally released game titles, experienced by over 11 million people worldwide. Some of his clients in the gaming industry have included Microsoft, Firaxis, Activision, Big Huge Games, Microprose, Double Down Interactive, IGT. He's also composed over 185 pieces of music for TV, film, TV specials, so forth and so on, which include ABC, CBS, Travel Channel, Discovery, A&E, NBA, BBC, PBS, and it goes on and on. He was also awarded 2 patents for game audio delivery. Duane's a great guy, great synthesist, great musician and composer, and I'm really excited to spend this time talking with him about all things game audio. I think this is really important too for aspiring game composers and sound designers, as well as seasoned and established composers and sound designers. So I think you'll really dig this conversation, and I'm really excited to bring you my buddy Duane Decker. So again, if you dig this, you like it, please subscribe, please like, and without further ado, let's get at it. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen, my buddy Duane Decker. All right, everyone, we're here with my good buddy, Duane Decker. And, Duane, you and I have known each other for a long time, and we're both synthesists, we're both musicians, we both, compose music for different mediums. But if you can, for the audience, just, tell me a little bit about your background. I mean, I know it, but, I think folks would find it really interesting because before you start, I think what makes your background so interesting is it's very similar to mine, right? We grew up in synthesizers, we grew up as musicians playing in bands or session work, and then we kind of find ourselves going down these alleys. So I think it's fascinating, and I think it's very unique. So tell me a little bit about how you kind of joined this crazy circus.
It when I was a kid, my godmother was a pipe organist at church. And once she took me to her church and I watched her practice, and, the pipes were literally 2-3 stories high. So you get that killer organ feel. And she let me play it after she was done practicing. And I didn't win anything, but ooh,
Yeah, it makes some really cool noise.
That kind of spurred me on. By the time I was 8, I had seen drummers, and I was going, yeah, that's what I want to do. And so what was it, 3rd grade, had a little stint with an all-girl competitive color guard where I was their drummer at 11, I think. And these are teenage girls. That was fun.
I was gonna say, sweet gig.
Yeah. That didn't last long, but by the time, let's see, what's the next step? Well, high school, probably first year of high school, or maybe last year of junior high, I joined bands. I started playing in bands. My family moved from upstate New York to San Diego. Didn't take long to join a band there. Started getting paid to play, which was cool. You're actually going to pay me.
Right. Actually, that's a bonus.
Well, yeah, and you start doing gigs, and some gigs are better than others. Bands never last for one reason or another. So you kind of hip hop between this, that, and the other thing. But I learned tons. I was in a band, very creative people, a little nuts, but very creative
Band.
people. And we would do rock versions of things like Night on Bald Mountain,
Oh
you
man.
know, and it was mind blowing in that I was still a drummer and singing, and but it exposed me to different things, very creative things. What else happened? Oh, well, I majored in music in college. That's where I designed and had my first synthesizer built. I couldn't afford an UP 2600. I really wanted one, but that owner's manual, I pulled an owner's manual. I was given an owner's manual by Tom Oberheim, and taught me everything I needed to know about synthesis. So an electrical engineering student at college needed a project, and I needed a synthesizer. We got together. He built it for the cost of parts, believe it or not.
Wow. Crazy.
And I used that puppy for 4 or 5 years, literally on the road. After well, I had solo acts. The solo act included, I was playing drums, flute, Rhodes, piano, and synthesizer, and singing.
Wow.
Which it was a pretty bizarre act. But joined up with, after college, joined a band that had been on a circuit that I played in San Diego. Met them at a cinema in a movie theater in Hollywood. It just random. I was in Hollywood trying to shop my solo act, and the labels weren't interested. But the last day I was in Hollywood, I go, I'm just going to go watch a cheap matinee. And I go to this matinee, and it was a stupid movie, but behind me, these guys were sitting, and I didn't know it. I turned around and I go, what the hell? So got together after the movie. A week later, they asked me to join the band, and spent 4 years touring the US with them. And that was grueling, because I mean, when you say 4 years, I think out of that 4 years, I was home in San Diego for a couple of weeks.
Wow.
We literally would go from town to town over and over, trying to establish a following. So that was a kind of a cool thing. After that band, I decided I wanted to try session work. So I found a used modular mode 3C being sold by Beaver Krause. I don't know whether you know who that is. Early electronic music pioneers. And went up to LA, bought it. They had just a room full of modulars.
Yeah.
And this was one that they didn't need. So I'm just going, yeah. Thinking that I was going to get session work out of just having a mode.
Right.
No. But it landed me other things. I joined another cover band out of Denver, toured with them for a few months. That kind of flaked away when the singer wanted to become a jeweler.
Oh, interesting.
But right as that was happening, I got a call, joined a band in Salt Lake City, Lois Lane, and all original band. We ended up moving to Chicago, because the circuit there is just righteous for bands. At the time, it was, you could play any night of the week. We could pack the place any night of the week. You know, we were surviving. We were eating.
Yeah. That's a good thing.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? But like any band, that didn't last either. The singer wanted to move the band to Salt Lake City. I was married by that time. Mary and I were just gone, no, this isn't going to work.
Right.
There's no record deal here. So we moved back to Chicago. I decided to do my second solo act, which was two OBXAs, Oberheim OBXAs, a DMX, DSX, Moog Taurus pedals, and a PA. So that was interesting. We put together a corporation to get the funding.
Yep.
And I played all kinds of gigs, literally anything from a wedding to opening up on a concert stage. And the drawback was that in those days, everything was digital. Perfect.
Yep.
Everything had to be loaded onto the digital equipment.
Right.
And hard disk drives were just insanely expensive at that point. So I had to load everything using a cassette, like an audio cassette. So depending on how complex the songs were, I would have to stop every 8-10 songs and reload everything.
Right.
So that was kind of a drawback, but it also landed me gigs in the Midwest college circuit, and those were fun because here's kids that, you know, they're open-minded.
Right.
You know, they want to see something new. Let's see what happened after that.
Well, you know, let me stop you there, because one of the things I think is really interesting about your background when we get into the gaming side of things is you really spent the early part of your career building your chops, right? I mean, you were a musician, a multi-instrument musician. You were intimately familiar with synthesis, both analog and digital, which, you know, particularly early in that time, there weren't a lot of musicians. You know, there are a couple people that could move a few knobs and make some weird sounds, but to actually use instruments like this musically was really starting to come into its own. And, you know, I remember, I think I told you, I still have your record with the Oberheims and the DMX. And I remember listening to that thinking, man, well, this is super cool. I mean, this was great stuff. So my point is that you really honed your musicianship and craft, both as an instrumentalist, but also as a synthesis, which I think is really interesting, because I don't know how many people really focus on that part of their craft anymore, especially with loops and sequencing and all these things. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that the onus on being a proficient musician isn't quite as high as it used to be today. And so I think that's amazing. But one of the things I think is interesting too is that's how you and I met each other. We both worked at Kurzweil, right? I was a product specialist. You were the Midwest rep, I think, and then ultimately became a product specialist. And this, you know, folks, this goes back, you know, what, mid 80s. You know, we were dealing with the K250 and the K150, and I think even my tenure there covered the 250, 150, the digital pianos, the original ones that looked like a piano, and then the original rack mount units. But you know, but I know you've done more than that. Like, I know you were at Kurzweil, you were at Octave Plateau. Tell me a little bit, tell the folks a little bit more about kind of that synthesis side, because I think in regards to when we talk about gaming, having this technical background in not only synthesis, but how audio works, how sounds are created, how they interact, I think is really important when it comes to a technical medium. But you know, what do you think? I mean, that's kind of my take on it. But
as a composer, as someone who is trying to impart feelings, you need to know your instrument, irregardless of what it is. It could be a computer, but which is basically that is my instrument now. But I think in the bigger scope, yes, learning all of that stuff does help you and frees you to do interesting things. Let's put it that way. when you limit yourself. I mean, I can't listen to radio much anymore. I used to love it. Now it's kind of like
Right.
heard it.
Very
I've heard it
formulaic.
1,000 times.
Right.
You're, you know, I strive at least to write stuff that's interesting, and there's so many different ways to do that. When I was at EMU, they had the Proteus 3, I think it is, World.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And there were so many cool instruments in that.
Yeah.
That
Very.
it just kind of, yeah, but using these really unique instruments, because to me, guitar, bass, drums,
Right.
or a string section, that was kind of my palette. And boy, it opened things up, which actually turned into a very good thing, because as I was doing video games, one of the games I did when I was at Microsoft was Rise of Nations, which, interesting story behind that is they wanted the big, huge games, the developer in Baltimore, published by Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
So I was kind of here, help them. And they wanted world music. And out of my experience, world music is very cool, but
Yep.
a lot of people don't understand it
Yeah.
or why it's there. I mean, it can be very harsh. And
Yeah. I want to mention something on that, because that's something that always has been a pet peeve of mine. When composers use ethnic instruments or world instruments, especially in the early days, right? When sampling came about and everybody decided to use the shakuhachi or, whatever it may be. But I'm very cognizant about anytime I use ethnic instruments. I'll give you an example. I was working on a film that took place in Australia, and it had the director wanted to use the didgeridoo and all this stuff, and so for me, I was kind of thinking, all right, I'm an American composer working on an Australian film, and they want the didgeridoo. Like, I have to be careful as a composer to not make it a cliche.
right.
And and it just, like, it really bothered me, because I'm like, man, I got to be really smart in how I use this instrument. And just quickly, what I ended up doing was using the instrument differently. I used it more as a percussive instrument and getting different sounds out of it versus the traditional droning. But I think when I think back of the 90s and late 80s, when Akai had the S900 and EMU had the emulator 2, and then the Proteus came out, like, I noticed it just, and maybe it's just because we can't help ourselves, because it's a new sound, it's unique, it inspires us, and then we just overuse it on everything. But I mean, what was your experience on that?
Well, I
Especially on that, having that tasking of doing something world music. Like, how did you balance that without being over the top?
I used ethnic instruments, but in an orchestral setting.
Mhm.
The orchestra was always there.
Yep.
And I would throw in certain sounds, but it was more of, it's a different key signature or a different tempo than what you would normally hear.
Mm-hmm.
And just like I'm doing now with my Minuten series, it's like, no, I can do whatever I want there.
Right.
But I'm inspired by what I see in a picture. And
Right.
this is a beautiful picture of a beautiful place or a scary place or whatever. And that kind of gets the thing going.
Yeah.
But at my roots, I'm still a rock, jazz, symphonic player. So that's always there. And it
Yeah.
always creeps in,
Yeah. I know. Yeah.
regardless of how weird I want to get.
Yeah.
Just,
I hear
oh,
you.
yeah, that would sound great here,
Yep.
You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, too, the other thing I think I would challenge composers to do when, dealing with ethnic instruments, and I think Thomas Newman does this really well, is finding unique ways to incorporate them in so that they're not cliches, where they may, you may use that instrument percussively versus melodically, or you may use it to, create an atmosphere versus, carry the melody or whatever it may be. And I think that's interesting. And I think that's really cool that we have that ability now as composers to add those textures to our sonic palette, so to speak.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I do want to jump into the gaming stuff because you have such an amazing background in that. And I'll tell you a quick story on how I got into game audio. This goes back early 90s. The internet was still new. I was a huge Tom Clancy fan and still am. And I had heard through the grapevine that he was starting a game company. And I found his email. Ironically, I don't even remember how I found it, but I emailed him and I just said, "Hey, I'm a huge fan. I understand you're starting a game company. I'd love to do the music and sound effects for you." And he said, "Wow, great. We haven't opened the doors yet, but here's Doug Littlejohns, who is the CEO of the company. Reach out to him and then we'll put you in contact." And anyways, that's how I got started doing gaming with Red Storm Entertainment. And it was like, just like one of those crazy things. Like I didn't know anything about game scoring. And I mean, I played video games, but I didn't know the technical processes. And of course, it was much different back then, I think, than it is now. But it was a lot of fun. I did the sound design and music for a bunch of their games. And it was really an interesting medium to get involved in. But I'd love to hear how you got involved in it, because early guys, I know like Bill Brown, like he was my nemesis. I love Bill Brown. He's a great composer and he's a super nice guy. But he was like, because at Red Storm, it was either me or Bill. And, Bill ended up beating me out more than I beat him out. And so anyways, that's that story. But anyways, how did you get involved with that?
I got to a point where bands, I really didn't want to join another band. Solo artist, that's so dicey. And there was an article, I think in Keyboard Magazine, about how game audio was starting to get more sophisticated. Mm-hmm. Being in Chicago, we had several pinball companies. We had video game developers. And I just, like you, I started sending things out.
Yeah.
Back then it was more a cassette tape by mail.
Right.
But and I tried. I had a couple interviews. I didn't know enough about games, the technology in games, for a couple of them. Then a recruiter got in touch with me. She's a wonderful lady, and she gave me a tip about Fast Interactive, a new company, startup based in Chicago, but their first thing was BattleTech, which is a physical location-based game where people will come and spend gobs of money sitting in these little machines and battling each other as mechs. Mm-hmm. And they started to go, we need to make some money. So they made a video game of that. And for gosh, how long was I there? I don't think they interviewed anybody else. Not that I know of, because they were so small and such a tight-knit group.
Right.
And I just came along at the right time. Same thing as, when I was hired to do pinball games. I sent out, demo tapes and resumes by mail, and was banging on doors. But you get to a point to where there's a right time and a right place, and it's frustrating all the way up until there, and then
Right. Then things kick in.
that's it.
Yep.
That's it. And that's how I got into it. I had been doing pinball games before Facet. That technology was interesting. Like I was saying before, 6-voice FM chip.
Right.
So that was it was really cool though, because I had seen Patrick Moraz play a K250, which was what, 8-voice?
Yeah.
And he could make that thing just unbelievably prolific, polyphonic,
right,
with 8 voices. And that I kind of took inspiration from him. And I go, well, okay, I only have 6 voices, but if he can do it, especially when I can program everything to change on a dime, that was cool. So that's how I got into pinball. And then FASA was the next step after that, because arcades were, pinball kind of died. And so that's initially how I got in.
Well, I just want to say, I think it's interesting too. Maybe modern game composers don't necessarily have the, same constraints that we had. But I remember when I was doing stuff for Redstone, a bunch of different companies, at that time period, they all had the same challenges, right? So a PC only had so much memory, and, a console only had so much memory. So as a composer and a sound designer, you were constrained by memory, and how long the piece of music could be, and how long the sound effect could be. So it forced you as a composer to think about how you were going to write this music, and more importantly, to write it in a manner so that when it loops naturally, not these terrible loops. And the same thing with the sound effects. If it's an ambient or wind or whatever it may be, they have to loop naturally. So I think that's an interesting skill set that, again, I can't speak necessarily for modern composers. Maybe you can. But early on, I think that was a unique skill set that we had to develop, to think about that from a compositional standpoint, because you're always fighting memory. And I remember, engineers or the producers coming back and saying, we love this piece of music, but it takes up too much memory. Can you cut it in half and we can loop that? And it's like, yeah, but that's where the big crescendo happened, so,
right.
But what's your experience on that? And do you think that's still an issue today? Or less so of an issue than it was back, in the, early 90s, mid 90s?
Well, ever since I started in games, memory has always been an issue, always. Even when I was doing pinball not long ago, because there's only so much memory, and art tends to take 95% of it.
Exactly.
So, no, we don't need music.
Right. Wait, hey, Dave, we need you to cut that back, because graphics wants to put another, piece of geometry or another layer on. Right. So we need the memory for that, not the music.
But it is a skill set that you have to learn. Like I said, pinball is still like that. You only have so much memory, and pinball in particular, because it's so immediate. Push the button, play the track, and within a couple seconds, literally, you're done. But that background track can last long enough to not want to shoot yourself boring.
Right.
But there's still that constraint, and it keeps getting better and better with memory. And I'm sure that skill will be less important as we move on. But I don't know, when you're talking about ambient stuff, a museum or something, well, you're still composing, but it's longer. But it has to have a natural loop. Even if it's 20 minutes, it has to have a natural loop. So yeah, it is a skill set that is
And it's an
important.
art form to get those loops,
Yes.
crossfaded so that you're not getting that, that hit point that you can hear. Um, and the thing that I always marvel at is as technology advances, I think you do still have those memory challenges, but you and I had talked about the complexity of like even casino games now. These things have surround sound. You're in you're not just sitting at a slot, pulling the lever. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting technology going on there. So I'm curious, what's your perspective on that, from a composer and a sound designer to deal with very complex hardware now, not just creating a piece of music to keep you busy during the game, but these are truly immersive experiences.
Well, yeah, you always try to do that. Even if you're talking about the old school, one-armed bandit stuff.
Right.
You have a demographic. That demographic looks for one thing, a win or a lose. I guess that's two things.
Right. Yeah.
Well, they're looking for a win.
Right. Yes,
Which,
for sure.
but that immediacy in slots was something I didn't understand before I actually got the master class by working at IGT.
Right.
And it was, we were always going out to casinos, and looking, listening, trying to figure out what motivates these people. Why is this game better than that game? If it's a license, you can kind of go, well, yeah, okay, it's Alice in Wonderland, that's why. But there were so many games that just blew me away. They were so well done, original games, and you always aspire to making your stuff as good or better.
Right.
I don't even know where I'm going with this.
No, I mean, but it's a good point. And, one of the things I thought was really interesting, and I had told you I'd been in Vegas not too long ago. And what kind of astounded me in a sense was the immersiveness and the surround sound of of that experience. And I'm curious, when you're composing music, and you and I had talked about this, do you, unlike film, where you might, send the dubbing stage all your, stems, and then they'll place and do that stuff. Are those requirements put on the game composer and sound designer to, and maybe perhaps let's focus on the slot side of things? Because I think you had said generally no, because there's some security issues. So maybe you can elaborate on that, because I think that's an interesting point that folks may not understand or appreciate.
Oh, well, when you work in the gaming industry, gaming meaning gambling,
Mhm.
everything is regulated, everything. And it is heavily regulated. Everybody who worked at the factory had to go through extensive background checks to get hired. Some needed to get more documents or qualifications or whatever, licenses. As a composer, I'm not going to break anything.
Right. Right.
There's no way for me to steal anything. It's like, I wouldn't to begin with. But it now I got off on another track.
Well, again, I think it's an interesting point, because what I see, and I don't do as many games now as I had back in the day, and I wasn't doing tons of games back then. It was just one of the mediums I was scoring for. But today's game composer has to wear multiple hats, right? They've got to understand not just how to compose in multi genres, in a way that's compelling, but they also have to be technologically proficient. And I know a lot of game companies are like, hey, we want a composer who's, John, cross between John Williams and Hans Zimmer. And then we want, you to be a master of WIs or FMOD or, some technology. And then, oh, you have to do this as well. And you got to manage the talent. And it seems like a lot of these in-house game companies are looking for somebody that's multidisciplined. And I'm curious what your experience has been on that. And I guess I'm also curious how successful they are in finding that unicorn that has all of those skill sets, because I would imagine maybe you're a really good composer, but, you're familiar with WIs and all these things, or maybe you're a really good, technical audio programmer, but you're just kind of more of a musician. Oh yeah, I can compose, but I mean, what's your experience been? And what do you think about that?
Well, in my mind, you have a focus. You're tasked with coming up with content that's going to not only initially sell the game, but that's going to have a phenomenal tale. Mm-hmm. Meaning you're going to hear from people. Like I still hear from people from some of my games where I grew up on this stuff. Right. But I could not have done that if my time was split between doing all these different things. And I've gotten to the point now to where, no, I'm not going to be split among all these things. The technology changes all the time, which means you're always studying that. As a composer, you always need to practice and hone your craft. It blows my mind how a company that's supposedly thinking forward about the value of the work can't understand that. You hire people for what they're great at. Mm-hmm. Don't try to pull them in all these different directions. And it's not like I didn't get pulled in different directions throughout my career, but when push comes to shove, if you're going to tell me I'm this and this and this and this, or we're going to find somebody else, I go, okay.
Right. Find somebody else.
Find somebody else, because I can deliver on the music and audio side. Mm-hmm. And I'll do whatever you think implementation will work.
Do you think it's helpful? And again, I'm thinking of the aspiring composer and sound designer. I guess I would argue perhaps it's helpful to be familiar with technology, so you can understand what your colleagues and peers are doing and what they're ultimately going to do with your work product. But I guess personally, I have no interest in being a WI's master or, an implementation master. I'm a composer. And maybe that's like saying, oh, well, you're a purist. Well, you shouldn't be saying that. But that's what I do. And I do that well. And like you said, I don't feel like I can give you the best version of myself if I'm also trying to think, shit, I got to, figure out how this is going to be implemented. I got enough things to worry about, but it's interesting because, I can't tell you how many young composers I talk to that ask me the same question. Well, should I focus on implementation or should I focus on music? And my response is be familiar just so you can understand what your peers are doing and what they're going to need to do with your work product. But if you're a composer and you want to be a composer, then be the best composer you can be. Now, maybe that's not the best advice because maybe the game companies do want that unicorn and I don't know. That's a tough thing. And I guess, what would your advice be to the young composer?
I think the same way. Yeah. It's like, if you're going to excel at something, that's your main focus. Mm-hmm. And if you're working in the game industry, you do have to understand, at least on a basic level, what's necessary, the techniques involved, what the important parts are, like looping. Mm-hmm. That's a whole masterclass in itself.
Yeah, that's an art form.
Yeah, it is. And if you're willing to learn all of those things and stay true to what you really want to do. If it's a composer, then you need to stick to your guns.
Mm-hmm.
I've always tried to do that, and putting food on the table
Yeah.
is a a thing of maybe this isn't a good idea.
Well, you know, the other, you know, it's just an interesting thing. I was talking to a colleague who was at a huge game company. He was the audio director. He's not there anymore. But, you know, one of the things we were talking about was some of the benefits of working as an in-house composer and some of the downside. I mean, the upside is you get to write music and the budgets are huge, so you can usually get an orchestra and, you know, live musicians, and which is super cool, right? To be able to do that. The downside is just like in, you know, film, you don't own the music.
Yep.
And, you know, there's no copyright, there's no royalties, there's no residuals, there's it's purely work for hire, which
Yep.
it can be tough on a composer, especially if you create music for you know, a top AAA game, and you like, well, you know, I got $100,000 salary, and that's good, right? I got benefits and a 401k, and that's a good gig for a composer. But at some point, you also realize, like, you know, this sucks. Like, I'm writing all this great music, and you know, I don't get any credit for it. So I
Yep.
imagine that's got to be tough too.
Yeah. Microsoft, well, actually, all the companies were like that. It's your work for hire.
Yep.
And I was able to talk about my music in games
Mhm.
for places like VASA and Microsoft. Um, but to this day, I don't see a penny. I look at YouTube and I go, all my stuff is here. I don't
Right.
make a dime,
Yep.
nothing, and
Oh,
I'm sure it has gone further than just YouTube,
yeah.
But when you're used to broadcast royalties,
Mhm.
I'm on ASCAP. I think you're BMI,
Yeah, I'm BMI.
but every once in a while you get a nice side hustle check, which
Yeah.
it always was for me. It was a side hustle. I wasn't trying to do it full time, but at least there it's like, well, I'm getting reimbursed for my work
Right.
years and years, literally years and years later.
Yeah.
And oh, it's in Thailand.
Yeah. I know. I always marvel at that when I look at my royalty statements. I'm like, wow, I guess that's pretty cool, you know, that it was played in Lapland and Finland, you know, that, that's pretty cool. Yeah, they heard my music. You know, it's always crazy. But you know, like me, you are also a sound designer. So, and that's, we could spend a whole nother conversation on sound design and all that fun stuff. But I'm curious, uh, and the reason I'm curious is because I thought at some point in my career, you know, I would stop doing sound design, but I can't tell you. I mean, I've done so many projects where I've done the sound design and the music and the post production of all the audio.
Mhm.
And whether it's in commercials, whether it's, you know, regardless of the project. So I guess I consider myself fortunate that I have become very proficient at sound design and audio post and all that fun stuff, just out of necessity. But I'm curious for you, what do you like better? You know, or do you like both? Like, I find I get creative satisfaction out of sound design. Maybe not as much as composition, but equally, like I do enjoy that art form and creating new soundscapes and new sounds that no one's ever heard of before. And I can't, I mean, I've gotten some, well, I'll give you a quick example. You know, I was working on this Tom Clancy project, and one of the sounds they wanted was the sound of a M1 Abrams tank turret spinning. And I'd spent some time with the Marines recording all kinds of stuff. And I said, okay, can you know, spin the turret? I want to record it for the sound. And they're like, well, it doesn't make any sound. I said, well, what are you talking about? It's got to make sound. And they're like, no, and they're spinning it around and it's silent. And I'm like, ah, shit, what am I going to do? So I called the producer. I said, hey, this thing doesn't make any noise. And they're like, well, we need noise. So what I ended up doing was I I used a can opener and I recorded the sound of the can opener and I tweaked it and slowed it down and, messed with EQ and a bunch of other stuff. And I said, oh yeah, no, it does make sound. Here's the sound. Like, oh yeah, that's the sound we were looking for. But it was like, I had to like the actual tank didn't make a noise when the turret turned. So
Yeah.
you got to be creative. Like you got to come back because
Yeah.
my job is to give the producers what they're looking for. And
Yeah.
so I just, thought in my head, well, I remember the old World War II movies and what that sounded like when the tank turret would turn and it sounds like a can opener. And, so you kind of go through that process. But so that's fun. I love that part of the creative side. But for you, are you more a music guy, more sound design guy, or are you kind of like more like me in the middle?
I, my favorite is composition.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the way my brain works. Did I ever hate doing sound design? No. Actually, when you're so involved in stuff, it's good to jump from, okay, I've got this track done, music track.
Mm-hmm.
I need to do this, and it gives you a space to unwind.
Yep.
You're still just as creative, but it's a different creative entity. And
Yeah.
you always jump back. I mean, if I only had one thing that I could do, I would compose full time.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel the same way. I feel like for me, I don't want to say it was a necessary evil. It was just necessary. It was part of
Yeah.
the project. And,
Yep.
they're like, well, can you do the sound design? I'm like, yep, I can do it. And I'll figure it out. It's like when I got
Yeah.
started in jingles, right? I had the first call and they're like, hey, we need a jingle for this. Have you done jingles before? I'm like, absolutely. Yeah. And what I did was I literally hung up the phone. I went to Barnes and Noble and I looked at books, looked up like what are jingles? Oh, they're 60 seconds, 30 seconds, so you just do it because you got to get the gig and hopefully you figure it out.
Yeah.
And that's how I did it. So let me ask you this. One of the things I think is most important as a composer for media, whether it's or for visual media, whether it's film, TV, games, interactive, whatever it may be, is your workflow. And anyone who's done this work knows you have a lot of constraints, right? You've got budgets, you've got creative constraints, you've got timelines, and for me, I work in a very intense process. Like I'm very iterative. Like what comes out of my head down to my hands from God gives me the opportunity to just, do what I do. And if my technology doesn't work and I can't keep up with my brain, I get really frustrated, like
Yep.
really frustrated. And so workflow is critical for me just on how my whole process works. And any disruption to that workflow, again, is usually results in a violent outburst. So I'm curious for you, what's your workflow like? Because there's, again, we could spend hours talking about templates and how to create your templates and your palettes and so that your work flows properly for how you work. But tell me a little bit about your workflow. What do you use? What's in your audio toolbox? What's the secret sauce to your magic?
Well, the tools and the process are different things.
Mhm.
Um, I've got, well, you can see behind me all the monitors and stuff. I write all in the box.
Yep.
I've my studio is set up in four sections. What you see here is my main composing and creating workstation. Behind me is the Alesis Surge kit. So, and what is it called? Control pad. I hardly use that one. I don't like it, but I have it. I'm speaking into the right side, which is run by a very old Mac Pro Tower, which is just communications and archiving. I have another Mac over here, a Mac cylinder that I dedicate to mastering.
Okay.
So I've got all the tools I need.
What
I
DAW
have
do you use?
sorry.
What DAW do you use?
I have been using digital performers since I actually performer. Magic Dave from Motu
Yep.
chased me around when I was working at Kurzweil, and yeah, I want you to try this and play it in in your clinics and stuff. And I go, oh sure, and I got hooked,
Yep.
hook, line, and sinker. By the time I got to pinball, digital performer was out, so I upgraded to that, and I'm using Native Instruments Contact, East West Play, Composer Cloud X, Vienna Symphonic, Garrett Strings, Symphony of Voices, and a ton of other stuff.
Yeah.
And I also have since Onotcheria and Omnisphere. So I mean, and this is like many years of hoarding sample libraries
Exactly.
and upgrading. But some of those old ones, like the what was it? Virtuoso Strings.
Yep.
It's like old school, but there's something about those really intense attacks that sometimes, okay, they don't have to be played up front, but man, when you want an aggressive string section,
Right.
that thing is just, it's righteous.
It's funny you say that, because I do the same thing. I mean, I still have a ton of sample libraries for like my Akai S1000 and S3000, and some of them are just some about them, that just
Yeah.
that just very unique sound that you can't get from the other stuff. But I wanted to touch on something you mentioned, mastering, and when it comes to game audio, is your finished product mastered? And when I say mastered, like, are you using any kind of EQ and limiting and compressing, or do you send your client basically the raw mixed file?
No, it's always finished.
Okay.
I do all mixing, EQ. It's literally mastering ready.
Mm-hmm.
I throw it over to that computer, stick it in SoundForge,
Yep.
and do a hard zoom into sample level, because I know how many samples that is.
Right.
So I just write that down. I go, okay, I'm going to have to trim this to loop it properly.
Yep.
To exactly to the sample. And I will sometimes take I forget what it is. Something
Yeah.
to make sure that the levels are accurate. Like I have a log to say, okay, I'm looking at the levels, I'm writing them down for every track that I do to where they're consistent.
Yeah.
And I take ozone and maximize, tweak the levels so that both of the pairs of levels are within the same range.
Yeah.
Then it's a matter of, okay, what format do I need?
Right.
If you know mobile gaming, MP3s don't loop. They just don't.
Yeah.
So you have to figure out, okay, what are you using? Apple? Are you using PCs? Are you using Google phones?
That's a really interesting point, because I was gonna say that when you started talking about formats, is depending on the project and what you're working on and what their technical specs are, what's in AIF and what's in Wave, I've run into issues with looping and so when you convert, like if everything you're working on and exporting into Wave, but then they say, oh, we want them in AIF or whatever file format they're looking for, it goes back to what I always think about, which is the really hard part about producing audio for media, which is, what is your output? I'm not talking about the audio file, but when you give your work product to them, there is a lot of technical specification you've got to ensure you're in compliance with. Otherwise, things get out of whack. You know, when they put it into their system, then it's not, hey, it's not looping. And well, why is it not looping? And then it was looping fine and it was this. And you find out they did that. And then it turns into a complete, debacle. So I think that's something that, again, aspiring composers, I mean, no, not just knowing your musical craft, but your technical craft is really, really important.
Yeah, because you're delivering that product.
Yeah.
They don't know why it's broken.
Right.
You should know because you gave it to me.
Right. And they don't have time, because they've got their own compressing schedule that they've got to do. And so what they assume, they being the audio implementation team, that when you give them the final work product, it's ready to go. They can just lay it in and be good to go. And yeah, I think that's a really important part for young aspiring sound designers and composers, to be very cognizant of those technical details. I do think that's interesting. What do you think, Duane, is the minimum skill set that aspiring composers and sound designers should have? I'm curious from your perspective, and then maybe I'll tell you what I think. But I think we're probably going to be pretty close on this. But what's your take? If the young kid's graduating from school, or he's a talented, or she's a talented musician and wants to get into this space, what do you think that minimum skill set is to be successful?
I wrote myself notes because my memory's like a sponge. Oh, no, the opposite of a
sponge. It used to be a sponge, right? Now it's like a sieve.
No, it should be, but it's not. And in my mind, when you ask that question, first of all, you have to have a burning passion, because you're going to work your butt off learning so many things and making so many mistakes, which is good, because the more mistakes you make, the better you are the next time. But you spend endless time learning and practicing. And that's really the gist of it. I mean, what are your competencies? Well, even if you don't know X, Y, Z, if you have a burning passion, and you're going to find out, you are valuable.
Right.
Because you'll solve the problem. When you're working for someone, they're not going to tell you what to do all the time. They're looking for you to solve a problem. And audio is their problem because they don't know what to do.
Right.
So you have to have the burning passion to do it, and the time and energy spent on learning anything that you don't know. Looping on mobile was, shoot me.
Right.
Because Apple and Google phones are totally different.
Yep.
One will accept OGG files. The other needed M4A, and you have to figure out, okay, does your system do that? My latest gig, I sent them, I forget what format I sent them, but I sent them something that quote unquote should have worked, and they said, no, it doesn't, and let me look into it. And again, it's my problem, not theirs, because I gave them something that didn't work. And I sent them M4As and OGG compressed files. And I said, do either of these or both of them work on your system? And the OGG file did. So it's like, but you have to know that could be an issue. What are the solutions? Well, I've worked with M4As and OGGs before because of the difference in the format, the hardware.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. When I think about it, as an aspiring composer, I would say it's a given, right? If I'm going to hire you and I want to hire you as a composer, I'm making the assumption you can do the job as a composer. You can write the music, you're creative, you can do those things. But going back to what you said, solving problems, right? There's always a problem, and there will always be problems. So how do you solve those problems? Do you have the technical skills to be able to resolve whatever they have for technical issues. But there's also, I think, I'll give you an example. One of the things that I thought was really interesting about working in the game industry space is, and it's very similar to film and television, where you're not just dealing with the producer, right? The producer may give you the asset lists and the creative input and all that fun stuff. But a lot of times you spend more time with the engineers, and maybe you'll deal with the character designers. And so you've got to have really strong interpersonal skills. You've got to be able to talk to creative people. You've got to be able to talk to executive people and even the marketing people, because they might say, hey, Dave, that theme you wrote for the game, we want to use that in the marketing. Can you give me a 30-second version, a 15-second,
Yep.
And so being able to communicate with diverse constituencies, I think, is critically important. And I feel like sometimes that's lacking in today's world. And that's the same thing with film. And I always encourage aspiring composers and sound designers to understand the different roles in game development or in film production, right? Because you're not always going to deal with the director, and you're not always going to deal with the producer. You're going to deal with editors and graphic designers and people that have different priorities, different challenges, different timelines. And if you can't engage at those levels, I think it's going to make it very difficult for you to be successful. And that's probably good advice across the board. But I think that's important. And I think the technical skills are critical. And I would encourage kids, young composers, to understand about the WIs and FMOD. I have my own opinions on to what degree, but just understand how the sausage is made. Right. That's the key, because then you can be more valuable and go back to what you said, solving problems. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had people come back and say, hey, this is great, but we thought the graphics were going to do this, and that was going to be really spectacular, and they were less spectacular than we thought. Is there something you can do to, and it's the same thing in film, right? You might have a scene that they thought was going to be great, but the delivery of the actors wasn't great, or the lighting, or whatever it wasn't ideal. And they'll come back and say, can you put your magic on it and bring it to life? And I don't think it's dissimilar to video games as well. So solving problems, I think, is critical.
Well, and when you're working with a team, I think the most important part is to know that you're working with a variety of temperaments.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are flaming hot, others are flaky, and no offense to all those people that I just insulted, but there's a lot of temperaments. I mean, people can be intense, they can be sweet and kind, but you're going to always have to deal with that variety. And I found that you can make a pretty much difference. Simply smile.
Yep.
Be kind.
Yes.
Remember your teammates' names.
Right.
Those three things, when I was at Double Down, I always did. And I always found that, okay, this is peaceful. I'm calling them by their names. They feel like we're connected.
Yep.
It worked.
And I think that's a really interesting point. And I think it's, again, I don't want to keep saying these are lost points, but I do feel like they are lost points. And for me personally, I want people who I work with or work with me to like me, not because I'm looking for acceptance, but I want them to know, if I got to go to Dave for something, he's a good guy, he's fun, he's easy to work with, he'll take direction, he'll solve the problem. Like I don't want anyone, whether it's a director, an editor, a producer, a graphic designer, to feel like, oh shit, I got to call Dave, this is going to be fun. Like nobody wants that, right? Because it's hard. Like
it's unpleasant.
Yeah, but while we're doing what we're doing in the heat of the moment, it's hard. There's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of timelines and frustrations, and the last thing you want to be is the guy that they don't want to call because they don't want to deal with a jerk or somebody who's complicated. Or, and I'll go back to this. I think it's really interesting from the perspective of when you deal with different creative types of people, they communicate differently, right? You and I could talk to each other and we could talk about arco strings and we could talk about ostinatos and this, that, and the other thing. And we know what we're talking about because we can communicate at that level. But a graphic designer or an engineer, or they may not have the technical musical vocabulary to articulate what they're looking for. But I look at it and say, well, it's my job to get that from you. And so the way I interact with you may be different than the way I interact with, the artist or the audio engineer, because we have common vocabulary. We can articulate our ideas. But when you're dealing with these different constituencies, if you can't pull that information out and distill it into what they're looking for, it's really hard. And it complicates things if you're not a nice guy. And I'm saying not a nice guy for nice guy's sake, but like genuinely, like you want people to want to come back to you and view you as part of that team. And like, hey, Dave can solve the problem. Duane can solve these problems. Yep. He's a good guy. I love talking to him. He's always positive. And that's not always the case. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to film people and others and like, oh yeah, we worked with a composer. It was miserable, and I'm like, well, you should have called me. Well, we did, and we are. And so here we are, but yeah. You know what I mean? And I think you agree with me on that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I've been in way too many rock bands.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It was good training.
A lineup of wow jerks.
Yeah.
It's the egos and the just wow.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, like I said, it's already a complicated industry.
Yep.
And to not have those interpersonal skills, I think is, again, I would say that's a life skill that everybody should have, but it's really important when you're dealing with creative stuff. I think the other thing too that's really important is, and this is hard, right? I talk a good game, but I don't always, play the same way. But you have to realize that the work product you're developing is work product, right? It's a product, and you're being hired as a service provider to deliver a product. Mm-hmm. And so when you give that to them, just because they say, oh, that's not working for me, or no, that's not the vibe I'm looking for. Like I said, I will tell you, you should look at it and say, okay, great. What didn't you like about it? Let me go back and do it. And it's great, but it's virtually impossible. I still been like, oh, man, that was the best freaking piece of music I've ever written. What are you talking about? But again, you're delivering a product. I always say to folks, my job is a service provider. You're hiring me to provide a service. If that's solving a problem, if that's delivering a piece of music. And if you don't like that product that I've delivered, I've got to be a big boy and go, okay, what didn't they like about it? And then go back and fix it. But it's hard, right? I mean, sometimes you can go, yeah, that makes sense. Or sometimes you go, yeah, you're right, that sucked. And I can do better. But it's hard as an artist, right? I always tell people, if you want to be in this industry, you're not an artist, right? You're a service provider. If you want to be an artist, be in a band or, do a duo or a single act, but don't be an artist, because nobody wants to deal with artists, right? They're a pain in the ass, they're temperamental. They're, it's my art. Well, no, I'm hiring you to do something. I mean, right. Have you found that? Like, do you agree with that? Or am I
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I can be egotistical, but anytime that kind of stuff happens, it's like, now you hired me to do this work. If you're not happy, explain to me what it is that you're hearing that you don't want to hear or would like to hear.
Right.
And okay. And one of the recent things I've done was exactly that. The format changed from, 30 seconds to 3 minutes. And then, which was awesome because I could actually build on the track, and what they wanted was something less than what they thought they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
They told me rave
Hmm.
and dance club.
Right.
Outrageous. You're in Vegas, you're partying at 3 a.m. And I gave them that.
Yeah.
And they got it and said, that's pretty heavy. So I thought heavy was cool, but great. I yanked those things out, and the second try was fine. But you don't nickel and dime your clients.
Yeah. Well,
So if there's something that they need, give it to them, because if you don't, you won't have another client.
yeah, no, that's a great point. That's a great point. You know, and the other thing too that you have to keep in mind as a composer, I think, is it's not necessarily that they don't like what you gave them, but it may not, you know, what they had in their head and what was ultimately delivered may not be the same, or they may see it with a visual and go, you know, it just didn't work. You know, we
Yeah.
thought that, and that was kind of the vibe we were going for, but now that we see it, you know, so I think those are important things too. So that's why you have to try to not get bummed out about it. Yeah, again, it's all about perspective, and
Yeah.
it's the same thing in film. It's the same thing in TV. I think just the creative process, being able to take that rejection. As I said, I haven't mastered that skill. I still sometimes feel like, oh man, that sucks because that was I really thought that worked, and you said you wanted X, Y, and Z, but sometimes X, Y, and Z, you know, they change their mind, and that's okay. That's their prerogative. Your job is to, you know, bring their vision to life. So,
Or maybe they just thought it would work, and it that's always the case with any kind of visual stuff. You know, you have an expectation, you know what you want to see, but when you see the finished product and then add the audio,
yep.
does it really, how does that work? Does it mix well? It
Yeah.
doesn't play nice together. Sometimes it just doesn't. And
Yeah, and that's, I mean, like I said, we could spend hours talking about all the tips and tricks of composing, but you know, when you think about something as simple as, you know, I'll go to a film scene, for example, maybe there's a child and a female in the scene. And as a composer, you got to think about, well, what kind of registers do I want to be writing melodic content, or do I want high strings there? Because now it's going to fight dialogue. And it's kind of the same thing in gaming. You've got to be cognizant of all of these. I don't want to call them creative tricks. It's just part of the gig, right? You need to know how to write music for visual media, because it's not the same as just writing a piece of music. And I think because games have become so much more cinematic, that a lot of those skill sets that you've learned as a film and TV composer are starting to translate, even though I still feel like they're discrete mediums. But a lot of that stuff I think plays over. So again, if you're an aspiring composer for this medium, these are all things I feel like you need to know and learn about. But look, I know we're going to be running short on time here in a little bit. I want to just run a couple quick things about this industry with you. Where do you see this going? I mean, what do you see the future of game audio and video games going? I mean, do you see it going more and more cinematic? You know, where that line is really blurred now between what we see in film and television is on par with what we're seeing in our game consoles or online or on our phones.
I just, when you gave me that question, I was scratching my head, and I was going, you know, I don't know where it's going. Then I saw a commercial for a video game. I should have written it down. It was something that came up really fast. And I started looking at it, and I go, is that film
Right.
or CG? It was that good.
Yeah.
And I was just going, it must be CG because they're advertising a game. So the blurring of all that stuff, I think the technology of audio will take baby steps. Immersive, I got in on the ground floor of surround,
Mhm.
and nobody could afford 5 speakers and a subwoofer.
Right.
So I always wonder, okay, theaters can do that. Big entertainment complexes can do that. That's not going to translate to, your home TV set for 99% of the people. So I kind of wondered.
But then look at, now you look at, even just base TVs now. I mean, they've got surround and people's living rooms, you got surround, and, now you got the chairs with the surround. I mean, it really has progressed very quickly. Back even when I think back early days when I was doing gaming, we were doing some pretty heavy duty stuff, but where we've gone in the technology and the democratization of technology, where even your phone, has like simulated surround and ambisonic and all these other crazy things that I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier, which was, should game companies be looking for that unicorn? That's the implementation engineer, and she's also the composer, or should you focus on that or this, and maybe that's an age-old debate on, should you specialize or should you be more of a generalist? I still don't know the answer to that, but I would say if I were, as a film and TV composer, I would look at it and say, it's really important for me to know how the editor works, because I probably spend more time with the editor than I do with the director. And so it's important for me to understand his pain or her pain or their workflow or the challenges that they deal with in pacing and all the other stuff. So that's important. So I guess I would say, from a game side, and I'm curious on your feedback, it's important to understand, back to what we said, what your peers are doing and how they use your product. I'm not convinced, like, I would never want to be the editor on the film. Although I know, a friend of mine, John Ottman, is a great composer. He's a great director and he's a great film editor, right? So he just happens to be super talented to be able to do those things. But me personally, I wouldn't want to be a film editor, but understanding their process helps me be a better composer. So do you think that translates to gaming as well?
Oh, sure. And you need to be cognizant of what, in particular, the engineers who actually come up with the technology to make things work.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be understanding that not everything that you're thinking of can actually be done. Mm-hmm. And maybe it can be done, but they can't do it right now because they have 90 other things on their plates.
Yeah, I mean, it's our industry is long gone are the days where, I'm just a composer and I'll write music for a commercial or for this or that. I mean, there are great opportunities, but there are also, technological competencies, I believe, that need to be part of that skill set of any modern composer or sound designer. I want to jump back on something here before we wrap up. Do you have, in your work, do you find that game composers are delivering stems, or are they delivering finished stereo, wave, AIF, whatever?
Finished.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, nobody, in my experience with the clients that I have, they expect me to deliver exactly what goes into the game.
Okay.
I can't even remember the last time I delivered stems.
Okay.
And I think that's what film stuff.
I mean, most people, in film, they're looking for stems, especially the bigger projects. I mean, if it's a smaller, lower budget indie, you can probably get away with some of that stuff. But if it's a bigger, studio project or bigger independent, they're going to want stems. And I understand that. And I'll just tell you that I'm not a big fan of it. And it's more an emotional reason. I totally get it. It's part of the gig. You got to do it. But I also feel like it's like, hey, Duane, I want to hire you to score this project. And you're like, great, Dave, I'll do the project for you and I'll give you, it's like going to the baker, right? I want a cake. Okay, I'm going to make you a cake and give it. Well,
Right.
now it's like, I want the cake, but I want all the flour, I want the shortening, I want the sugar, I want all the ingredients with the cake. Right. So it's kind of
Yeah.
like, man, and then, I always get paranoid. I'm like, well, they're going to make derivatives of my music. And then it's not what and every composer I've talked to, kind of feels the same way. It's a necessary evil. And I get it from a technical standpoint, why they want stems. But I was just curious in your experience, if you had seen my experience in gaming. I've never had to deliver stems in gaming, but that's not to say they don't require it. Just my experience, and it sounds like your experience that was not the case. Um,
Correct.
Interesting. So let me ask you this: young aspiring game composers, sound designers, or composers, that in general, electronic composers. Any last words of wisdom? What do you think? What should they? What would you tell them? What would you tell a young Duane Decker, aside from maybe not getting into this industry?
I would have gotten into it anyway.
I know.
It's, um, nobody quite understands why we do these things other than us.
Right.
There's something about it. In answer to your question, I think I've been through so many career changes in my life, and most of them were just out of my control. You have to expect that there are going to be circumstances beyond your control. Don't beat yourself up over it. Just smile and go, okay, next thing, what am I going to do? And I've thankfully always been successful at trying to find something else that brings me that passion and satisfaction. Be kind, roll with the punches, never give up. You have to be relentless in your pursuit. And if you're kind, your reputation will precede you. Be nice.
Yeah. I think that's underrated, right? Be nice,
Yeah.
be a good person, give it 110%. That goes a long way.
Yeah, it does.
It does.
Well, it's bigger than our business. It's
Right.
humanity. And
Yeah.
we
Well,
could go on with politics
yeah.
forever, but that's not the talk here.
Yeah. But I always look at it and I tell people that I work with, it's for me, and I can't speak for every composer, obviously, but for me, I view it as a relationship, right? I, I view what I do from that perspective, that it's a relationship versus a transactional interchange. And yes, there's been transactional interchange. Hey, Dave, we need music for this film. We need this, and then here it is, and I do it, I deliver it, and they pay me, and that's it. And it's a transaction, and everybody was happy, and it was all good. But I like to think that that relationship is stronger than just a transaction. And so I focus on the relationship. Like, I want to be that problem solver. I want to be that person that you can call and know that, okay, if I call Dave, it's good, right? It's going to get done. It's going to get done on time, on budget. It's going to be fun. It's going to be pleasant. He's going to solve some problems, and I just know that when I work with him, this is the way it is. And so for me, that's, I think, is really important. And part of that, a large part of that, is just being pleasant, being a good person, and being patient and understanding of what everybody else has to do. Because by the time we get involved, a lot of times, particularly in film and TV, it's at the end of the process, right? And I would argue, from my experience only, maybe it's different, but from my experience, by the time I get involved in a game, it's usually midway point. They've already got characters, they've got a narrative, they've got all these things, but they've been working on this for 2 years,
Yeah.
So it's kind of like I'm coming in at the end when things are really stressful because they're like, look, we got to get this thing going, we got to button it up and get it ready. And if you're a jerk or causing problem, not causing problems because you're a jerk, but like injecting risk into the process, nobody's going to want to work with you, right?
That's true. That's true.
Mhm.
Your reputation is critical, and there are always pluses and minuses with the people that you work with and for.
Mhm.
But remember, if you treat people well, most of the time you're going to be treated well.
Mhm.
Um, I've always found that to be the case. Maybe I've been a jerk sometimes, I don't know, but I always tried my best to
Right.
be friendly and kind and helpful.
Yeah.
Um, although I do have an ego about my craft,
Yeah, we all
I
do.
try not to show it. I nobody cares.
Yeah.
What problem can you solve for me?
Right.
you know?
Yeah. Again, I'll go back to what we said numerous times, and it's simply, you have to solve a problem, and that problem is providing. And maybe it's not necessarily a problem, but there's a task that needs to be taken care of, and um, our job is to provide solutions to that task. And I think it's hard because a lot of people think about this, and there's certainly that component, but oh, I'm a composer, I'm going to write music for all this stuff and it's going to be exciting, and I'm an artist and they're going to love me and my music. And if that's what you think, then this is not the industry to be in, right?
No.
Like I said earlier, if you want to be an artist, don't get into what we do, because our job is to provide these services. So for any aspiring composers out there and sound designers, I think hopefully you will have taken some of this to heart. There are soft skills and hard skills, just like there isn't anything in life. And I think to be successful in this space, some of those soft skills are really important because you're dealing with creative people, and we all have a vision. And if we can all get on that same vision and deliver the magic that we do, then everybody wins. It's a win. So Duane, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to kind of share your insight and your thoughts and your experience. And it's been great to see you again. It's been too long.
Yeah, it's been to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome.
I always enjoy talking to you. And we have a very similar track record
Yeah.
of doing stuff, not identical, but it's always good to commiserate with somebody who's been through similar experiences
Yeah.
as us, and for so long.
I know, right? Good Lord. I mean, you don't, you look, 1 minute you look back and go, am I that old? Damn. How quickly did things go? You know,
Wait.
but I want to finish on this last point, and then I will finish because everybody's probably thinking, Dave, shut up. But one of the questions that I get asked a lot is how did you get involved in this industry? Like what was your path? And what I've always learned is everybody, with the exception maybe you and I, maybe others, but most people come at it from so many different angles, and everybody's entry into this world is radically different. But for you and I, we both came in through synthesizers, right?
Yep.
That was how, growing up in the space, with my dad, and then working as a product specialist. And then that led to working in studios as a session guy and the programmer. And then that led to jingles, which led to TV, which led to games and film, so you and I came very similar in that path. But I would say to younger up and coming composers and sound designers, you got to find your own way in because everybody's way is different. There's no set do step one, step two, step three equals success, right?
Yeah.
And it's probably the way it is in life and in any field, but definitely in ours. And I think that's important. So last words, and I'll stop. And again, Duane, thank you so much. I really appreciate it and enjoyed our conversation. And hopefully we can touch base again and talk about maybe some of these things at a more detailed level down the road.
Excellent. Thank you for having me on. It
Awesome.
was great talking to you again. Good seeing you.
Likewise. All right,
Yeah.
man. Let me wrap this up here, and we'll talk again. Thanks, my friend. And there you have it. There is our conversation with Duane Decker. I hope you enjoyed it. I really do. Duane's got a lot of great insight, and I hope you found it of value. If you did, please subscribe and please like this video. Also, leave in the comments. If there's a topic you think we should cover and want to discuss or you want to hear more about, please let me know. I will put all of Duane's links in the description below. And again, I really hope you enjoyed that conversation and were able to take something away from it. All right, let's move on to some shameless promotion here before we wrap up. If you're into synthesizers, sound effects, sample packs, and loop libraries, definitely stop by my DFMG Signature SFX website. There's some great patch books for the ARP 2600, the CAT SRM, and the Minimoog there. There's some great cinematic sound effects and a bunch of sample and loop libraries, all optimized for Ableton, Reason, Acid, all that fun stuff. So there's a lot of cool stuff there. You can also check out my blog at DFMG Modern Audio, where we talk about all kinds of stuff on all kinds of topics regarding the modern audio composer and sound designer and producer and all that fun stuff. Lastly, check out my latest sample pack called Maniacal Modularity. This is a great sample pack, has over 140 sounds, all from the ARP 2500. It's got some really cool loops, bass sounds, lead sounds, LFO type, rhythmic type deal. It's pretty cool, all beat optimized. It's only $39. So if you're into that kind of thing and you want to update your sound or add some cool stuff to your track, definitely check out Maniacal Modularity. Last but not least, I get so many questions from young and up and coming musicians and composers and sound designers that I decided to create a mentor program. Within this program, we can talk about all kinds of different things, whether it's scoring or composition, career advice, synth sample programming, sound design, general mentorship. It's pretty affordable stuff. Space is very limited. So if you are interested in this, definitely check it out at dfmgsignaturesfx.com, and love to find a way to work with you. All right. I hope you enjoyed it. I really appreciate you guys. Again, if you dig this, definitely subscribe and like this video. We've got some more stuff coming, but I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Composer's Corner.